Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Thank you very much for joining me tonight. I think I've got a pretty good episode for you today. I love talking about humanoids, and that's what I want to talk about tonight. I call this episode 10 Startling Cases of Humanoids and Aliens. So these are cases which come from all over the world, including Canada, the United States, Brazil, Australia, England, Wales, Spain, Sweden, and France. So quite a wide variety of geographic areas. The cases I've chosen today start all the way back in the 1930s up to the 1970s, so quite a long period of time as well. Most of these are multiple witness cases as well. Not all of them, but definitely most of them, and some quite a few witnesses actually. And some of these cases do involve very compelling evidence of various kinds, such as landing traces, physiological or medical effects, electromagnetic disturbances, and animal reactions. Those are the most common types of evidence, and we definitely see that here. So yeah, I've chosen these cases because these are really unusual humanoids, really startling cases in some ways. I've said it before, but each case adds to our knowledge of what's going on here. I love doing this research. I think this subject is super important, and everyone deserves to know about it. So let's just get started. And the first case I'd like to talk about today, I call 10 Little Aliens. This is a very early case, starting in January of 1931. And this one took place in Eslov, Sweden. This is a really unusual case. Now this one is a single witness case, so largely rests on purely anecdotal eyewitness testimony, but nevertheless I found it quite compelling. The witness seems very honest and sincere, and his story is really unusual. I don't think I've heard anything quite like this one. This case comes from Swedish researcher Anders Liljegren, and it originally appeared in the Swedish UFO magazine UFO Information. This was in the March-April 1973 issue. And the sole witness is Helge Eriksson. At the time of his encounter, he was 65 years old and worked as a cattle herder on a farm outside of Eslov. He had gone to visit a friend for a few hours, and late in the evening, this was just after New Year's in January of 1931, he was walking home and had an experience that would remain etched in his mind for the rest of his life. And as Helge says in his own words, I was not far from the farm where I was working when I saw 10 or 12 small grown men walking towards me. I spotted them about 50 meters away, and they approached rapidly. They were so small. They came up to my knees about, and I remember feeling heavenly afraid at the remarkable sight. Now it was a moonlit night. There was a layer of snow on the ground, so Helge could see clearly as the little men passed right next to him, literally only a few feet away from him. And he said they looked human, except they were extremely short. They had long beards and wore dark green robes. They were marching together at a quick walking pace, talking loudly to each other in some unknown language. Now he said their heads were disproportionately large in relation to their bodies, and he noticed that their robes had hoods, and that the entire uniform was one complete piece, no markings on it at all, and they were walking in two rows, kind of like a formation of geese, he said, one after the other, talking, sometimes clapping. To him, it almost looked like a military force. And they walked in a strange way, quickly, purposefully, and very easily, seeming almost to float, he said, though they were making quite a bit of noise. And again, as Helge says in his own words, I was extremely scared and had to really steel myself not to run away from the place. I was there, only a few meters from them, the old men, so I could count them. I concentrated on the faces, which I thought seemed harsh and cruel somehow. They were dark in complexion, and their beards seemed very long. Now Helge felt certain that they saw him as he watched them, but they paid no attention to him at all, seeming not to care that they were being observed by him. But he did notice a peculiar and strong chemical-type odor coming from them, and as he says, I could smell it for a long time after they passed. Now they did not leave any tracks, though this is not too unusual because it was a very hard-packed snow. And the men marched past him towards an alley that led up to the farm where he worked, and he watched them move up this alley and saw that there was, quote, a strange blue-violet glow. Now this was surrounded by a kind of, as he says, mist or kind of fog. Now this light was extremely intense, and it was flashing in blue, violet, and yellow, and at the same time he could hear a strange whining sound. And as Helge says, they disappeared into that glow. In a flash they disappeared, as if by a machine. I heard just a whiff of air, and they were gone. So after that happened, Helge went home and remained in shock. He didn't sleep at all that night. He later did tell people about what he experienced. Some believed him, others did not. He really doesn't care either way because he knows what he saw. And as Helge says, I never experienced anything like that. And when it happened, I was completely clear in my head. They were no ordinary people I met. I immediately thought that these must be people from another world. Yeah, I like that case for a number of reasons. It's just a really unusual testimony. It starts very early in time, 1931. Not a lot of cases of humanoids at that time. It does appear that these are ETs, given that he saw this huge bright light, heard a weird noise associated with it. I can't say for sure because he didn't actually describe a structured craft of any kind. But the witness himself is convinced that these were ETs of some kind, people from another world. But so unusual, these short little bearded guys. Not a lot of cases like that. And now we move to the next case, which I wanted to include because the way this ET is described, in terms of a humanoid form, it's not that uncommon, but how he is dressed, that's very weird. And I call this case the ET in the purple cape. There are two primary witnesses, but apparently a bunch of people did see the UFO as well. This is a landing case during daylight hours, pretty unusual. A very close-up sighting of a humanoid. This one took place on February 29, 1964, in the crowded suburb of Plympton in South Australia. It's a pretty compelling case. This case was researched by Keith Basterfield. It's a very unusual and little-known case, a rare daylight case of a UFO landing, and a very unusual humanoid. There are at least two witnesses, two young boys, David and Ken. Their last names are Mathlin and Jensen, though it's unclear whose last name belongs to who. But one boy was about 10 years old and the other 9. It was 2:30 p.m., again, February 29, 1964, and the boys were outside playing near their homes in the suburbs of Plympton. Now their homes were located very near the Weigal Oval playing field, which you can see pictured here. Of course, back in 1964, the area was less developed than it is now, but still a pretty crowded suburb. And according to the two kids, David and Ken, they were out there playing when they suddenly heard a soft swishing noise, and looking up, they saw a glowing, disc-shaped object descend towards the nearby field and then land. And amazed at what they saw, they rushed forward to investigate, but decided to remain at a distance, hiding behind an old abandoned car about 200 feet away from this craft. Now this craft, they said, was kind of saucer-shaped or bell-shaped. It had large portholes surrounding the upper half, though according to one source, it was actually a clear, dark, transparent dome on top. But either way, it was quite large, and they watched breathlessly as a door opened up and a 7-foot-tall figure exited. He was so tall he actually had to stoop through the doorway, And according to the boys, he looked human. He had a large nose, but had copper red skin, which reminded them of a fresh sunburn. But most unusual were his clothes. He wore a tight-fitting blue-black tunic and a purple cape. He had shiny black boots, which the boys said looked almost metallic in texture. He had a belt around his waist with a device fitted on the front, which he continuously operated with his fingers. And on his head he wore a sort of pointed leather cap, which was fastened with a strap to his chin. And on his wrists he wore these silvery chain-like gauntlets or bracelets, one of which apparently had a thin tube which led up one nostril of the man's nose. So very unusual. David and Ken, in fact, were so amazed that they stood up, forgetting that they were hiding, at which point this strange humanoid apparently saw them, and in response, he immediately turned quickly and faced the craft and looked at one of the portholes. At that exact moment, another figure, dressed identically to the first one, appeared briefly at the porthole and then was gone. Seconds later, the craft began to make a humming noise, and the outer rim began to glow. Meanwhile, the first figure walked quickly back to the doorway, again stooping to get in, and went inside. And at this point, the door closed, the craft rose slightly, making sort of a fluttering, falling leaf motion, going back and forth. It then tilted at an angle of about 10 degrees and shot upwards at very high speed. Now, both boys said that they did hear a dog barking, apparently disturbed by the presence of the object. So the boys rushed home and actually didn't report it to their parents until 2 days later, and then the parents called the police. Both boys were interviewed by the police and showed no contradictions or any faults in their story. And in fact, both boys were Boy Scouts, and they said that they would swear an oath of honor on the truth of their story and all the details they related. They said the whole encounter lasted about 3 minutes and was actually very frightening to them. Now, according to researcher Colin McCarthy, who wrote an article about the incident for Flying Saucer Review, there were about 20 other witnesses who saw the object as it departed the area. So this case doesn't rest solely on the testimonies of these two boys. Now, there are, of course, a few detractors and skeptics, but those who researched the case firsthand do feel it's legitimate. And it was interesting because there does seem to be some corroborating cases occurring around that time. On February 3rd, 1964, in Gum Creek, which is about 100 miles to the north, an anonymous woman of a farm household said that at 2 a.m. she woke up to find her bedroom lit up with light. And standing about 30 feet away from her in the backyard was a 5-foot, 4-inch tall man holding this long rod and apparently also an 18-inch wide box, and he pointed it at the backyard. Now, her description of the figure's clothes is remarkably similar to that of the boys. She said it wore a blue-green outfit, a brown jacket with 3 buttons down the front, a brown balaclava helmet, a cord going down from his left shoulder. But like the boys, she said this figure had a red face and a large nose. He wore flared elbow-length black gloves. Now, as she's watching this thing, there's this light coming from above, so she speculates that it's from a craft hovering above the house. And she watched as this man held this box-like device and pointed it at various plants in the garden. It would make clicking noises, so she speculated he was recording or studying her plants, and did this for a few minutes, then apparently noticed her looking through the window and pointed the device at her. She became frightened when he clicked the button, or how he operated it, but nothing happened. And shortly later, she's in bed and a ring of light kind of appeared and she fell asleep. Now, she would later report further contact events with this same figure, and also over the next few weeks, numerous people in the area began to report UFOs over her farm and the surrounding areas. And importantly, some years earlier, her husband and their 2 sons did see an object hovering at very low level over the tool shed. So as I mentioned, the wife did see the same figure on a number of occasions, and once she says she smelled a strong, unpleasant, pungent odor, which reminded her of burnt bakelite. There you go. So that's actually 2 cases in one little segment there, which I wanted to include the second one because it might be related, given that the description of the ET is so similar. So yeah, really unusual. Not a lot of cases of people describing ETs in capes, but it does turn up. And I like the fact that there's so many witnesses in both these cases. I find that really compelling. Another interesting detail to me was the odor that the witness described, which we saw in the first case as well. So that's another interesting detail that I think we can learn something from. And it shows once again that these are physical events, not purely psychological, as some skeptics would like to say. So let's move on to the next case, because there's a lot of them. And this one I call the aliens on the highway. This is a really interesting case, which is primarily a single witness case, though there's outside corroborating witnesses who apparently saw UFO activity in this area on the same night. And this case also has some really compelling physical evidence as well. It took place on August 23rd, 1967, just outside of Joyceville. This is in Ontario, Canada. And I think you'll find it an interesting case that definitely deserves to be more well known. This case got considerable press attention and attention from researchers. The witness was Stanley Moxon, a 20-year-old salesman, and it was around 4 a.m. on the morning of August 23rd, 1967, and Stanley was driving to his home in Toronto. And he was about 40 miles southwest of Smiths Falls, between Joyceville and Glen Grove Road, and had just passed the town of Joyceville when he noticed an odd green light to the right. It was sort of at treetop level and descending towards the ground. And he said it looked as, quote, big as a house. So this was coming for a landing into the field, and as Stanley says, the light was so bright it was like daylight. I've never seen anything like it. So as he gets closer, he decides he's going to turn off his headlights, which he did, and he drove onto this little side road, a little gravel road, towards this object. He drove very slowly and drove pretty much right up to this object. And as he came up to it, he suddenly flicked his headlights back on to get a closer look. And to his shock and amazement, he was staring right at an enormous flying saucer. It was green in color, 30 feet in diameter, and it was landed on the road itself on 3 legs. But even more astonishing than this is that directly beneath it were 2 3 to 4 foot tall figures. He said they had bulky bodies, they wore white uniforms and helmets. And as Stanley says, they seemed to be walking around picking up specimens of earth and plants. They looked white, with bubbles over their heads. They seemed to be at work around the machine. Now, per Stanley, the figures appeared to be very surprised to have been suddenly discovered, and they literally flew back into the craft, which immediately took off at incredible speed and in total silence. In seconds, it was gone. As Stanley says, the ship looked like an upside-down bowl. It was on 3 legs, it didn't make a sound, just zoom, and it was gone. You tell yourself, this can't be happening. So he was totally amazed and drove immediately to the police station at Smiths Falls and reported his encounter. He assured the officers that he wasn't tired and seeing things, he hadn't been drinking. Now, he learned from the police that hundreds of other people in the area had reported seeing strange lights at and around that same time. So, after giving his report, Stanley and one of the police officers, Constable Steve Whitten, returned to the site of the encounter. And according to some of the sources on this case, they did in fact find burn marks on the road and 3 impressions which indicated that thousands of pounds of pressure had been exerted onto the ground. Now, here's another interesting detail, because Stanley says that within 12 hours of his experience, he was visited by 2 Air Force investigators from the United States who conducted a lengthy, quote, interrogation. And after talking to him for a long time, they told him that they would report their findings to him, and then advised him that he should keep his mouth shut about the sighting. Now, of course, he never saw them again, never heard back from them. But, to his credit, he didn't keep his mouth shut, and he spoke to reporters about what he had seen. I think you'll agree that's a very interesting case. And I have to give kudos to the witness, Stanley Moxon, for stepping forward and courageously going to the police and reporting his encounter. Most witnesses do not, especially if they've seen humanoids or been taken on board or anything like that. I mean, it's one thing to see a UFO and talk about it, quite another to talk about humanoids. And it's an interesting case because many people do describe ETs walking around their craft and picking plants and taking soil samples, which was apparently what was going on here. I found this case also interesting because of the landing traces and the fact that so many people on that night saw UFO activity, and that he was approached by apparently Air Force officers, intelligence officers from the United States. And this is England or Canada, so that's unusual. Too bad he didn't hear back from them, but again, I'm not surprised about that. So certainly an interesting case that deserves to be more well known, and that's why I included it in this collection. And now we move on to the next case, which is also super interesting. I call this one the Flying Humanoid. This one took place in the Midlands in England, central England, and it took place over a period of time. It started with a really close-up sighting, which took place in 1967, 68, thereabout. But the humanoid encounter took place in 1976. Now the witnesses are anonymous in this case, but it is a multiple witness case in terms of the UFO. And as you will see, it's a really interesting observation of a flying humanoid. And there's so many cases of this that I think people need to recognize that this sort of thing does happen. This very interesting and unusual case was investigated by English researchers Stephen Banks and Martin Keatman and was published in the March 1981 issue of Northern UFO News. The main witness is a 31-year-old mother known only as Patricia Kay, and she was driving with her fiancé. It was around midnight one evening in 1967 or 68, and they had stopped at a traffic light in Wolstenton after a night of dancing. Her fiancé was driving, and she was looking out the window when suddenly, right over the rooftops, very close, just several feet away, she saw a huge domed disc. She said it was silver blue-gray in color. It was a classic flying saucer with a dome on top. She said around the central perimeter there was a stripe with sort of regularly spaced portholes around the circumference. And these portholes were glowing with yellow light. It hovered for about 5 seconds. It was very clear and distinct, she said. And just as she cried out to her fiancé to look, this object shot up very quickly and out of sight. So unfortunately, her fiancé did not get to see it. And that was it. Or so they thought. Because it was some 9 years later, in the autumn of 1976, there was a second possibly related and far more dramatic incident. The couple was now married, they had an 8-year-old son, and he was in his room at around 9 or 10 p.m. when he heard this odd humming noise coming from outside. And he was an inquisitive child, so he climbed up on the storage heater to peer out the window and saw 2, quote, objects, which were moving at a slow kind of walking pace at low level in the sky, approaching in his direction. And as they came closer, this whirring, humming noise became louder, so it was clear to him that the noise was in fact coming from these objects. And as they got real close, he saw that these objects were actually two humanoid figures, flying in a horizontal position, sort of Superman style, with arms outstretched and legs together behind them, facing downwards. And they were both quite short, about 4 feet tall, he says, and dressed in white jumpsuits, which the witness said kind of, quote, like babies wear. So a onesie, full body white jumpsuits from head to toe. He said they also had white helmets with dark visors over the face, and they were low enough to be perfectly illuminated by the streetlights as they passed by. And the witness said that they were extremely close, within just a few feet of him. They did not make any movements other than to move across the sky, but he did see that there was a strange, quote, machine type device on their backs. It was white like the rest of them, but this device, whatever it was rectangular, fitted onto their backs, and had another additional structure like a box on top with a little button-like knob on top of that. And he watched them for a full minute as they moved off into the distance. And even after they disappeared, he could still hear the buzzing coming from them for a few seconds after that. Now, researchers Stephen Banks and Martin Keatman spoke with him directly and said his story remained consistent as he described the details. And interestingly, his mother, Patricia, his parents, had never mentioned their own encounter. So the investigators do speculate that the mother's sighting of a saucer and her son's very close-up sighting of these two 4-foot-tall white-suited humanoids could very well be connected somehow, but they have no direct evidence of this. Nevertheless, they call it, quote, an intriguing case. And I totally agree. So how interesting is that? Can you imagine looking outside of your window because you're hearing this buzzing noise and seeing a humanoid that close? And there's details to that case that make it sound very much credible to me, given that the witness describes how this humanoid had this weird box-like device on his back. He didn't know that his parents had had a very close-up encounter as well. It's an interesting case. And here's another one of my favorite in this bunch because it's so unusual, the description of the ETs and the events that occurred. I call this one, I would not harm a hair on your head. And that's a direct quote from one of the humanoids involved in this case, given to the witness. This one took place on January 8, 1974, and also on August 1st, 1975. It involves two separate events which took place in Springfield, Ohio, actually at the person's place of employment. It's a really fascinating case of a very close-up sighting with humanoids and some direct interaction as well. One of my favorite UFO researchers, Leonard Stringfield, is the primary investigator of this case, and this case involves a single witness primarily, a man from Springfield, Ohio, who initially requested anonymity, but we now know him to be Mr. John E. Justice, an employee of the Ohio Masonic Home for the Aged in Springfield, Ohio. And it was about 3:15 in the morning on January 8, 1974, that John Justice, then age 50, had left his place of employment. This is located at 2655 West National Road in Springfield, Ohio, and he began his drive to his home located at 429 North Jackson Street, a very short distance away. But he was still on the service road of this Ohio Masonic Home for the Aged and was about to get on Highway 40, pictured here, when something strange happened. And as John says in his own words, the first thing that happened was that my lights went very dim. Then the lights went out and the car stopped. I couldn't figure out what happened. All of a sudden, I saw these very beautiful lights in front of me. Now these lights were flashing brilliant rainbow colors of yellow, orange, red, purple, blue, and green, as he says, quote, like a rainbow. And he's watching this absolutely transfixed by the beauty of them when these colors transformed to a blinding, quote, steady white light. And then, to his amazement, was a strange craft hovering only about 6 feet ahead of him and 4 feet above the road, glowing with this brilliant, bright, golden light. And as John says, it was an oval-shaped thing. I was shocked pretty bad at the time. I couldn't figure out what was happening. I would say it was about 6 feet long. The whole thing looked like it was made of plain glass. Everything was lit up. You could see everything. The trees, the road, everything was lit up. And inside my car, it was light enough to clip my fingernails. So John could clearly see inside this object, because it was translucent, and to his amazement, there were some very strange-looking humanoids. And again, I'll just quote John directly, as he says, inside of this thing, as far as I could see, there were 5 women. They were very small, maybe just 3 or 4 feet tall. They had very long and beautiful hair. They had red, yellow, blue, and green dresses on, and the color of the seats that they sat on and the upholstery matched each one's clothes. This is something I've never seen in my life. The interior of the ship looked like gold to me. It was very shiny. The carpet that ran up the center of the aisle, like those in airplanes, it was a goldish color too. I've never seen anything like it in my life. So John wasn't able to see exactly what these beings looked like because, as he says, I wish I could. I'm not sure because their hair was so long and it covered part of their faces. They were all alike. So he's pretty sure they were females, but can't be sure. But John says that the hair on these figures was so long, it actually was touching the floor of the craft. Now John watched this object for just a few moments, as far as he can remember, when, as he says, quote, it went dark inside the ship. At this point, the craft then suddenly flared up with these same beautiful rainbow lights, blinking real fast, and as he says, it flew away, moving up and away at an angle very fast, and I didn't see any more of it. So John, needless to say, was very much impressed. He drove home, and when it got light that same day, he called Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And he tried to report his encounter, but the operator who answered the phone didn't want to hear it and told him that officials at the base had discontinued their study of UFOs and were no longer taking reports. He then tried calling the Clark County Sheriff's Department, but they again showed no interest either. So finally he called the newspaper. He spoke with a reporter by the name of William Connor, and William Connor contacted researcher Leonard Stringfield. So together they went to John and interviewed him and investigated the whole incident. And they learned something very interesting because it turned out that another employee at the facility, a maintenance man by the name of Nelson Ray Fields, said that on the same night as John Justice's encounter, the call radio, which he carries with him at work at all times, started acting up. And in fact, it went on all night, and that he said he could hear, quote, nothing but static on it. He told them, quote, my paging radio wouldn't work in the hospital that night. And he didn't just give up on it. He tried changing the battery no less than 4 times, but it still wouldn't work. Now, John Justice, the main witness, told Connors and Stringfield that, quote, I wouldn't mind seeing it again. I was scared, though. Little did John Justice know he would soon get his wish. It was about 1.5 years later, this time on August 1st, 1975. It was about 10 p.m., and John was again driving away from the Masonic Home for the Aged and was still on the actual company grounds when he suddenly heard a deep guttural voice coming from the passenger seat. and it said out loud, "Let go of the steering wheel." Now this naturally shocked John. He ignored the command at first, but it repeated, saying, "Let go of the steering wheel," and added the word "friend." So this time, completely shocked, John obeyed the command and let go of the steering wheel. And to his amazement, the car continued down this long driveway. So John, as you might expect, looked over at the passenger seat, and there was no one there, not that he could see, but he did see that there was a depression in the seat, just as if somebody invisible sat there. So John asked a question. He asked, if he was going to be harmed. And the voice replied, "Friend, I would not harm a hair on your head." John asked what they wanted from him. Now there was no response, but then the voice said that he was a spaceman and that he had been inside the object that John and his friend had seen a few nights earlier. As it turned out, just a few nights earlier, John and his friend had seen an anomalous star-like light in the sky, but hadn't really thought much of it. But then the voice said that John would be able to see him when he left the car, and then told him to look up above the power lines ahead of him. And when John looked, he was amazed because he saw a male human figure floating in the air 10 feet above the ground right in front of his car. This figure was male, human-looking, about 6.5 feet tall, and according to John, very handsome. He was glowing with light, and John said he wore this tight-fitting silver outfit with a belt, boots, and gloves, and he was holding his arms outstretched in front of him. The voice then said that John would be visited again, and he promptly disappeared from view, at which point John, now very shaken, took a hold of the steering wheel and drove home. And that's where it ends. If John was ever visited again, he didn't report it. Yeah, I love that case. I'm glad the witness did come forward. We know who he is. We know exactly where it took place. I love the fact that there's another witness who was able to confirm this case to a small degree in terms of there being electromagnetic disturbances coinciding exactly with the time of the encounter. I think that's significant. And it was interesting that the witness hoped for another encounter, and sure enough it happened. But to me the most interesting aspect is the description of these ETs. Short little humanoids with hair so long it reaches down to basically their feet. I mean, I don't know that I've ever heard that before. Just goes to show there's a wide variety of humanoid types out there. And here is another case which is super fascinating. I call this one, "I Was Really Afraid." And this took place on November 17, 1975, outside of Cedar Rapids, Iowa. It's a fascinating case with at least 2 witnesses, but what's really interesting about it is they both have slightly differing memories of what happened. And there's some interesting insights into this case about how a UFO encounter is recalled and how it affects a person. This case comes from longtime researcher Kevin D. Randall, perhaps best known for his work into Roswell, and it was published in the International UFO Reporter. And again, it's a very interesting case which illustrates how some close encounters with humanoids can involve weird memory issues, which is a common feature of many UFO cases. It was November 17, 1975, as 2 college students, Dave Vardaman and Suzanne Ehrenberger, were driving near the Palisades Kepler State Park. This is near Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Dave was driving when they both noticed a, quote, star-like object, which was hovering in the southwest sky. Now, as they watched, this object began to descend, and it was clear to them that this was unusual, so Dave slowed down and then pulled the car over on a side road, and they both exited the car to watch this thing. And as Suzanne says in her own words, "We watched it come down, and as it hit to about 100 to 200 feet, this bright white light came on. There was a big red light on the bottom. We were very close to it, maybe about 30 feet away. It was about 25 feet off the ground. It looked like it, or at least the top part, was made of glass. We could see it quite well. So according to Suzanne, this craft was about 30 feet in diameter, and the interior of the top dome glowed with light. And inside she could see two dark figures behind the light that looked like people, though she couldn't really see much detail, really only a torso and a head. Couldn't make out any facial features or anything like that. But to her they looked like humanoid figures. Now as they watched, this craft moved and went behind some trees as if coming in for a landing. And at that point a second object appeared, further away, and also began to descend. And as it came down, a third object appeared and also began to descend. And looking up, she says she saw about a dozen other star-like objects. Now, no point did either of them hear any noise coming from these objects. Now, here's where it gets kind of interesting, because the other witness, Dave, reported that despite Suzanne's testimony of a structured craft with a clear dome and apparent humanoids inside of it, he did not remember that. He could only remember seeing strange lights in the sky. And he was really quite surprised by Suzanne's assertions, but also made a very important admission. He told researcher Kevin Randall, "She remembered more than I do." So this could be a sign of a much closer encounter that he can remember only snippets of, and Suzanne remembers more. Now, in fact, when Suzanne first drew a sketch of this craft, she did not draw in the humanoids. She either recalled this later, or perhaps was reluctant to report humanoids, as many witnesses are, for fear of being disbelieved or ridiculed. But after seeing this, both Dave and Suzanne were very frightened. They went back into their car. They drove to Mount Vernon and called the police. An officer returned with them to the site. Now these objects that had come very low to the ground, of course, were no longer there. Though Suzanne pointed out these star-like objects overhead, the officer thought that these were just normal stars, but he did admit that both Dave and Suzanne were clearly frightened. So while Dave only remembered seeing lights, he was quite frightened apparently by them. And Suzanne herself, according to the officer, was nearly hysterical. He had to kind of talk her down from her fear. And it was absolutely clear to him that they were telling the truth. The police did check with local airports, who said that there were no known aircraft in the area, but that there was allegedly a fire near the location of the sighting, so they speculated perhaps they had seen that, which of course makes no sense because she saw a structured craft 30 feet away. Suzanne did share her story with newspaper reporters and said that she was not happy with the police's attitude. And as Suzanne says, "It really upset me because they took it so lightly. I was really afraid too, and I told them, 'Hey, look, this thing is real. We know what we saw.'" And as it turned out, there were other witnesses. A gentleman by the name of Richard Manson, a Civil Air Patrol employee, was driving near this area on that night and saw an object with bright red and blue lights. Now, he didn't think much of it until he heard Dave and Suzanne's story in the news. But the Mount Vernon police did say that they also received 2 calls from witnesses reporting strange objects in the sky in the same area, which was about an hour after Dave and Suzanne's sighting. So this is some pretty good additional corroboration. Now, researcher Kevin Randall suspects that Suzanne may have, quote, confabulated her memory of the humanoids, given that she didn't initially draw them. However, I think personally that it's much more likely that this is another example of witnesses having varying levels of memory of an encounter, because amnesia and memory problems is very often reported with very close encounters. And Randall, to my surprise, ultimately concluded that the witnesses had seen, quote, traffic at the airport, and nothing unusual. which really surprises me because Suzanne very clearly said that this object was 30 feet away. It had a structured metallic texture, a clear dome on top. It was a classic flying saucer. And also, let's face it, there were multiple witnesses who thought that the activity that they saw was strange enough to call the police. This certainly doesn't sound like planes to me, but you can make up your own mind about it. Yeah, I found that to be a very compelling multiple witness case. I know Kevin Randall is skeptical, but he's skeptical of a lot of UFO reports. I don't think this was an airplane, given that they saw it so close up, so close to the ground, the transparent dome, humanoids. It's not at all unusual for people to be very reluctant to discuss the humanoid aspect at first, so that could be what's going on here. Or perhaps she just remembered it later. Would love to talk to this witness and get more clarification. But I think it's a legitimate case because, again, there's a lot of outside corroborating witnesses who saw UFO activity in that area at that time. Now, moving on to the next case. This one's very unusual, I'm warning you. I call this one 50 frog-like ETs. Now, it's pretty unusual to see one humanoid or two or three. And I don't know of a whole lot of cases where people see large crowds of humanoids. Perhaps on a craft, that's one thing, but on the ground, not so much. And that's what happened in this case, which took place on May 2nd, 1976 in Menton, France. The witness is known, he's identified, he has given interviews. It's a pretty compelling case, and what's so unusual about it is the description of these apparent ETs he saw. Hard to say whether they were ETs or not, because he didn't actually see a craft, but you can make up your own mind about it. The main witness in this case was 21-year-old Dominique Minouge. He worked as a butcher, and it was around 9 p.m. on a hot, overcast, dark and stormy night as Dominique drove his Renault automobile between the towns of Menton and L'Étang du Banel. This is near Ardennes, France. And he was driving through a wooded area known as Le Bois des Rats, and he reached the intersection where the roads lead to Dubanel and De Vie, heading towards L'Étang. And this is when some lights or reflections in the field caught his eye. And looking out the window of his car, he saw an incredible sight. I mean, he could hardly believe his eyes, because standing motionless in the field were about, he says, 50 little green men that looked very much like frog-like humanoids. Now, this field was level with his car. It was just getting dark, but he says he could clearly see these little men. Some were facing towards him, others were in profile. He said they appeared to be green in color, though admits that this might have been a skin-tight jumpsuit of some kind. He couldn't say for sure, but he did notice that they had long arms that reached halfway down their legs. He could clearly see that they had webbed hands and webbed feet. He said their heads looked like they were covered in some kind of mask, kind of like a diver's mask or perhaps a helmet. But he could see that each of them had two large, round, red eyes, big, about 4 inches wide, that seemed to reflect light but weren't actually emitting any light. And he said their bodies were somewhat fat, though their arms and legs were very thin. And they were quite short. He estimates about 4 feet tall. And so many of them. Now these beings stood perfectly still, making no movement that he could see. They did not seem to notice him or pay any attention to his presence whatsoever. He saw nothing in their hands or anything like this, nor did he see any craft or object on the ground or in the sky. But seeing how many of them there were, and their strange appearance, he did become quite frightened. And he immediately pulled onto a side road, turned around, and began to head back in the direction he had come. But as he turned around, he saw another one of these little guys, and this one was standing very close to him, only about 10 feet away. So he got a good look at him. And he drove straight home, returning to his brother's house, and told him what happened. He was so frightened, he says, that he nearly suffered a nervous breakdown, and only got a few winks of sleep that night. Now, French researcher Monsieur Spengler, who wrote about the case in the French magazine Lumière dans la nuit, which means lights in the night, he interviewed the witness only 1 week after the incident. Now, Spengler encouraged Dominique to make a police report, which he did. And then the witness, the investigator, and the police returned to the location to look for any evidence. Unfortunately, they found no landing traces or footprints or anything like that. But I'm glad he did make a police report because this, I think, argues towards the credibility of his case. It's unlikely that someone who is hoaxing this would go ahead and call the police. So this is the kind of case that is really hard to investigate because there was no apparent landing traces, any electromagnetic effects, no real physical evidence of any kind. It's simply an anecdotal story resting on one person's eyewitness testimony, but nevertheless super interesting because there are many other reports of people seeing figures very much like he describes. And it's hard to believe that he would just make something up like this out of the blue. Most people do not seek attention. Certainly, they're not going to get the kind of attention you'd think. Most people are subject to extreme ridicule. And again, this is one of the reasons most witnesses keep silent. Now, let's move to the next case. And this one is a doozy. I mean, I've not heard a case quite like this. This one I call Almost Abducted by Aliens. This took place on September 9, 1976 in the small town of Vargem Grande. This is outside of Minas Gerais, Brazil, and it's a really unusual case. It is a multiple witness case. It does involve some very well verified physiological effects and some landing traces as well. But it's a very dramatic case, not super well known. Really unusual in terms of the description of the ET and the UFO itself and what happened to the primary witness. This case comes from Brazilian researcher Alberto Francisco do Carmo, and it's exceedingly strange and unique. Do Carmo wrote a letter to J. Allen Hynek informing him of the case, and the main witness is Hermelindo da Silva, who works as a farmer and trader and is a bar owner. At the time of his encounter, he was in his late 30s. He's married with 6 children. So it was around 2 a.m. on September 9, 1976, and Hermelindo, accompanied by his dog, was walking to his home on the outskirts of the small town of Vargem Grande in Brazil. And he noticed that his dog started to act very agitated. And he was only about 200 feet from his home, right near the bar that he owned, when the area around him suddenly became illuminated with a brilliant light. And at the same time, there was this loud humming noise surrounding him. And looking up, he saw a bright glowing object, which he estimates was about 12, maybe 13 feet in diameter, and had a dark opening in the bottom. At this point, Hermelindo's dog immediately began barking non-stop at this object in an extremely aggressive manner, and then suddenly seemed to receive some kind of shock, and then turned and ran away in absolute fear. Now, without warning, this glowing object darkened. Hermelindo was badly shaken, but thought that, or hoped, that the object had left. But still, very concerned, he ran immediately to the back door of his bar, which was just a few hundred feet from his home, and he tried to take shelter there. He tried really hard to open the door, but he was too nervous to unlock it, so instead he crouched against the wall and looked up to see if the object was still there. And it was. It lit up again making a loud buzzing noise, and now, thoroughly panicked, Hermelindo reacted by taking a piece of wood off the ground and hurling it at the object, which was hovering at this point only about 25 feet overhead. And he made a direct strike. He heard the wood actually hit the object, which again, the lights on it went out. The buzzing noise stopped, but it was instantly replaced by a loud hissing noise. And at this point, Hermelindo felt something strike his shoulder, actually knocking him down. So he was beyond afraid at this point. He jumped up and began to run towards his house. And he said the object moved, staying above him, and get this, it released 4 cables from the bottom side, which had what he described as hooks on the end. And a small being appeared from the opening in the bottom of the object, descended down one of the cables, and actually struck Hermelindo physically, knocking him down again. Now this being, he said, was humanoid, 3 feet tall, wearing a shiny gray uniform with a helmet. And this began a sort of 15-minute long struggle, as this being from the UFO tried to hook Hermelindo and pull him into the craft, while Hermelindo himself fought to escape. Now when Hermelindo ran away, the being, keeping its arms bent like a boxer, sort of pushed him towards these cables, these hooks. And Hermelindo was not having it. He grabbed the being bodily and lifted it up off the ground. He said it was quite light, but its body was hard as steel. He said it seemed to shake a little bit when Hermelindo grabbed it. But finally this being did succeed in hooking one of these hooks around Hermelindo's left ankle and immediately raced up the cable back into the craft, and at the same time this cable was drawn upwards, pulling Hermelindo off the ground. At this point he's dangling upside down towards the craft, he says. And as he got closer to the craft's opening, he could feel this very intense heat coming from it. Now, no surprise at this point, he's screaming for help. And Hermelindo's brother-in-law, who lived with him, heard Hermelindo's screams and looked out of the window of the home and saw Hermelindo being pulled up, upside down into the craft. Now, as Hermelindo reached the opening, he wedged his right foot against the bottom of the craft and managed to free himself. He fell about 18 feet down into a large yucca plant, cutting himself pretty badly all over his body. Yucca plants are very sharp. He quickly extricated himself and ran directly into the house. His family saw that he was covered with cuts from the sharp yucca plant. His left foot was already swelling up. His knee was badly bruised. His eyes were also swelling up. But as Hermelindo says, I hit him. I hit him a lot. I did everything with him. Punch. Heavy punches. So this UFO remained there, hovering over the home for a few more minutes, seen by everyone in the family, before suddenly darting away. Now Hermelindo never got a good look at the object. He only saw the bottom side. But his brother-in-law got a good side view from the window and said this object had a conical structure with a round top, giving it a bell-like appearance. So this was investigated. Afterwards they did find a footprint left by the being, but unfortunately it rained shortly later and the footprint was washed away. But reportedly Hermelindo was ill for several days following this extraordinary encounter. What a case that is. I mean, can you imagine having a UFO come down that low over you and these cables with hooks on them trying to grab you? Most people are just sucked up a beam of light. It seems kind of primitive to me, but there are other cases like this. So I suppose ETs have different methods of how they operate. I don't know. It's a very unusual case, but I think we have to take it seriously because this was well verified. It was investigated by professional researchers. There was an outside witness. There were physiological effects that certainly would not be easy to fake. And why would you? I mean, the witness was ill for days afterwards. So I think it's a legitimate case, but so unusual. And now we move to another case, which I call unnatural eyes. This is something a lot of witnesses describe almost without exception. When someone sees a humanoid, it's really the unusual eyes that capture their attention because they're so large or hypnotic or very wise. But this is another close-up case of a landed UFO with a humanoid. And yes, this is a single witness case, though it does have some interesting animal reactions, the kind I've heard before, but still really unusual. And this one took place on March 13, 1977. This is near Pembroke in Wales. And this one's for you, Roy. You asked for a case in your area, so I found this one for you because there are cases all over the world. And I think you'll find this one very compelling. This next case was investigated by UK researcher Randall Jones Pugh. And it's a brief case, but very interesting, involving a young man by the name of Stephen Taylor, who was 17 years old. And it was around 9 p.m., again on March 13, 1977, that Stephen had just visited his girlfriend and was walking back to his home near Pen y Cwm in Pembrokeshire, Wales. Now looking up, he was surprised to see a sharply defined, kind of pear-shaped object in the sky, which was glowing with a bright orange light. He was very much intrigued by what he saw, so instead of going home, he ran to a friend's house to share his sighting. But his friend unfortunately did not believe him. So Stephen left and continued his walk back home. He thought his encounter was over, but of course it wasn't. He had gone about a half mile when he noticed that something was blocking out the lights on the horizon ahead of him. It was about 9:30 p.m. at this point, and Stephen says he felt this strange wave of fear. He wasn't sure why, but as he approached closer, he saw that the lights were being blocked out by a pretty large dark object which was landed on the ground in a nearby field. And as he got closer, he saw that, yeah, this thing was big, about 20 feet wide, 30, 40 feet long, and he could discern a sort of faint glow coming from underneath it. So he stood there and looked at it. He lit a cigarette and stood there watching it. And this is when he heard footsteps. He could hear it walking on leaves coming towards him. And looking towards the source, he saw this 6-foot-tall figure coming right up to him. He said it wore a strange one-piece, kind of semi-transparent jumpsuit and came right up to him. In fact, Stephen was close enough to see that this strange humanoid looked human, but had very high cheekbones, unnatural-looking eyes which were very large and very round, kind of resembling fish eyes, he said. Over its mouth, he said, was a box-like device with a tube leading over its shoulder. And Stephen said it looked, quote, like a skinny human, 6 feet tall, like an old man. So he was filled with fear at the sight of this figure and actually swung a punch towards him. Didn't actually strike this figure. Instead, he turned and ran straight home. And once he got home, another odd thing happened. His dog began snarling and barking viciously in a way he normally did not do, and in fact had to be put outside. The next day, thankfully, the dog was back to normal, but the behavior was really out of the norm and clearly connected to this case. So again, this case was investigated by Randall Jones Pugh and published in the Bufora Journal. And really interesting is that Taylor's sighting was just 1 month after the very famous Broadhaven Primary School UFO landing, which involved not only a UFO landing, but a humanoid as well. Such a shame the witness was not believed when he described the initial UFO sighting in this case, because his friend could have gone out with him, gone looking, and they both would have seen it. And this would have turned into an anecdotal case, into one with multiple witnesses. I also find the animal reaction super interesting in this case, because I've heard this same thing before. Someone can come back from a very intense encounter, and their pet, who is normally very friendly, does not react that way, almost as if they don't recognize the witness. Makes me wonder if they're smelling something on them or sensing these ETs in some way that we don't understand. Yeah, the case is really interesting because the witness did try to actually punch the ET and didn't, but I can tell you that there are a few cases where people have laid a punch right on an ET. So that does happen. Yeah, it's an interesting case. And now we move to the last case in this collection, and I wanted to include this one because this ET is described in a way that I've never heard before. so many different types of ETs, and this one's unique. I call this one the alien with a mustache. And this took place on December 1st, 1977 in the small town of Puente San Miguel in Cantabria, Spain. It's a really interesting encounter with a very close-up, face-to-face encounter with a humanoid. And I like this case not only because the humanoid described is very unusual, but all the people throughout this town, I mean not all of them, but many of them, saw UFO activity on that night at the time of the encounter, which brings a whole new level of credibility to this case. This last and final case first appeared in the Spanish language book UFO Encounters by Iker Jimenez, and it was about 4:50 a.m. on the morning of December 1st, 1977. The main witness is Emilio Ruiz, who worked as a miner, and he was sleeping in bed on the first floor of his parents' home in Puente San Miguel. Now he shared a room with his younger brother, Cristobal, whose bed was right below the window leading to the street outside. This detail is important, as we shall see. Now suddenly, 4:50 in the morning, without warning, the dogs in the area began to howl loudly. And when the howling persisted, Emilio, annoyed, stuck his head out from underneath his blankets to investigate, and to his surprise, a bright light was streaming in through the small bedroom window. And as Emilio says, "At first I thought it was already daytime and that we had slept late." But as he continued to look out the window, he realized that the light was not sunlight, and in fact it was this pure white light, so brilliant that it was blinding. Emilio actually had to cover his eyes with his hands. And when this light started flashing strangely, he knew that something very odd was happening outside. So he sat up fully in bed and started to prepare to go outside and investigate, when he suddenly saw that someone was approaching his bedroom window in a very determined manner, with no hesitation. So this frightened him. He pulled the blankets up around him and continued watching, and very quickly, whoever it was came right up to the window and peered inside. And boy did Emilio get a shock, because he saw that this face was not human. The figure itself had to be very tall. He estimates about 9 feet, judging from the way it was hunched over to look inside the window. But as Emilio says in his own words, "It was horrible. A chill ran through me. The face seemed dark, black and hairless. And the truth is that I felt a deep fear. He had a very light, whitish mustache and large, round, expressive eyes. And I'm sure he watched inside. My brother was right under the window, but he was still asleep without realizing anything." So Emilio was absolutely frozen in fear, and watched as this tall figure stepped back from the window, and Emilio could now see that it was dressed in this sort of hockey-like tunic, and had a white belted stripe going vertically down the right side of its chest. He saw that its body was very thin. But as it stepped away from the window and into the darkness, Emilio began screaming. This immediately woke up his younger brother Cristobal, and by the time the being, of course, was no longer visible, but there was still this very brilliant, bright white light next to the house. So it was Cristobal who rushed outside, and as he says, "When I reached the door, everything stopped, as if going off." So morning came shortly thereafter, and they found out that the whole town was abuzz with this, because it turned out that many people in the town had also seen this brilliant glowing light. And one of the witnesses, a lady by the name of Balbina Noriega, said that she actually saw a structured object take off from an open field. Emilio's window faces a little area known as El Plaza de Javier Erastorza, and an examination of this area did show strange footprints, apparently from the being that had looked inside Emilio's bedroom window. So how about that? What an unusual ET. I'm really glad that the witness did have corroborating witnesses who saw UFOs over that town on that night. And of course, there's some apparent landing traces in terms of footprints being found, but a really compelling case overall. I can only imagine what it would be like to have your room fill up with light and look out the window and see a strange figure approaching, and then have him look right into the window at you and realize, wow, this is not a human. So there you go. 10 cases from all over the world from the 1930s up through the 1970s. Some involving many witnesses, many involving compelling evidence of various kinds. I'm always surprised that there are still people who are skeptical of UFOs and humanoids because there are so many cases. So I really appreciate you guys watching. That's pretty much it for today. I do want to add one thing. There are a number of you out there who are watching who have asked me to cover certain areas. So that's what I'd like to do. I'm going to put out a little request here, a challenge. If you want me to cover a case in your area, your hometown, or whatever, yeah, let me know. Put a comment in this video, name the town or the city you live in, or which you'd like to see an encounter from, and I'll see if I can dig one up. So this will be a by request future episode if I get enough reports and responses of that. Because I keep saying it, these encounters happen all over the world. I think pretty much every location on this planet has a long and rich history of UFO encounters if you dig hard enough. So we'll see how that turns out. Thanks, guys. I really appreciate you watching. I consider you my friends. So just much love to you. And as I always like to say when I sign off, keep searching for answers. They're out there. Keep looking for the truth. It's important. And most important of all, keep having fun. And I will see you next time. Bye for now.